Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hogg. My guest today is Jonathan Clements. Jonathan is an historian who has written many highly acclaimed books, mainly centering on the history of East Asia. And he's written on a huge range of subjects, but I first came across him when I read his book, Rebel Island, which is a history of Taiwan from its earliest days, pre-colonial times, right up to the present day. And I think people should really seek it out because Taiwan is such an important country in the world today. And I think Jonathan's book is incredibly useful in understanding its history. And the reviews in the press as well, they couldn't have been much more positive if they'd tried. Anyway, welcome, Jonathan, to the podcast.
Lovely to be here.
I feel my introduction really didn't do justice to the huge range of your work. Because once I'd finished Rebel Island, I enjoyed it so much, so I rushed out and got some more books by you. And I got one on Japan's war in the Pacific. I got one on the first emperor of China. And then there was a sort of a history of China, which was explored through its cuisine. And I'm also an anime fan, so I got your book on that. So you seem to have just an incredible range of interests.
Well, East Asia, luckily for me, is a very big place and covers a lot of areas. So over the years, I've my agent's very pleased I can handle China and Japan because sometimes China goes out of fashion for a while and we can switch over to Japan for a bit until people get interested again. So in terms of book sales and in terms of interest, it's very interesting to watch kind of my Amazon charts go up and down in terms of, what's on Netflix at the moment and what's in the news and so on. In an academic sense, most of my books are about the same thing. They are about state formation.
Okay.
You mentioned the first emperor, you mentioned Japan at war in the Pacific, you mentioned Rebel Island. These are all books about someone putting a nation together because, there's no safety net and there's no rule book. But someone has to invent these things and make them work. In the case of Taiwan, I think there's a dozen chapters in the book and pretty much a different polity is claiming Taiwan in every one of those chapters.
Yeah.
So state formation is something I really love. Technological determinism is something that I love, which is this is probably way too deep for the start of the podcast. We've already scared everybody off.
Go for it.
So I'm also a technological determinist. I love the way that technology influences history. And so in my history of cooking, for example, in my history of Chinese food, you can see the way that different technologies and different inventions and different acquisitions of geographical areas, different foods, transform what Chinese food is and how it can be made and what people can expect of it. So I do all those things. The other thing that's a really quite a recent interest of mine comes up in Rebel Island. It comes up in Japan at war in the Pacific as well, is songs. I am getting obsessed with not the way that history looked, but the way that history sounded. And so I often find myself asking, what did they sing in school assembly in Japan in 1941?
Yeah.
What's that song on the radio that you keep hearing in that movie? And so I do kind of delve around into popular songs, not just from the late 20th century, but, going way, way back into, what Japan, for example, was completely transformed in 1927 by not only the arrival of the radio, but the arrival of the gramophone. And so you get these amazing pop culture outreach moments in Japanese propaganda history. Like there was this song about a wizard in the street in China, which the Japanese army, they printed tens of thousands of copies of it on the gramophone records, and they basically strewed them across China to try and encourage people to think of the Japanese as kind of friendly invaders. It didn't work particularly, but it's this really obscure song which sounds like nothing unless you know the context it happened in. So those are all things that I find really interesting. And normally when you read one of my books, you find these kind of topics starting to haunt whatever it is I'm supposed to be writing about.
One of the frustrating things in the book, which I sense you found frustrating, is that you have all these songs and you think, oh, this is an ancient song, it goes back, and then you find it only goes back a couple of years, or at any rate, the lyrics only go back a couple of years, and trying to work out how old a song is incredibly difficult.
Absolutely. I mean, the concept of invented tradition is very, very big in modern historiography. There are all kinds of things. For example, the history of the kilt, which we now know to have been something that was basically knocked up.
I won't hear any of this. This is
The first clan tartan that was sold in Edinburgh turned out to have been knocked off on a Jamaican loom for slaves, and was then palmed off on some passing Scotsman. So this invented tradition. It's not necessarily a bad thing to discover that these things aren't as old as they are, but it normally turns out that various things that we all assume that everything around us has always been that way, and it's not necessarily the case. And so, yes, there are some lovely cases in Taiwan of, Annette Lu, who was the vice president of Taiwan for a while. She was at a conference in somewhere in Europe, I think, and she said, "Oh, I'm going to sing you a song about this kind of love affair between a Dutchman and a Chinese girl, and it's an ancient song, and it's very popular in Taiwan, and it's come down to us over the last 300 years." And blah. Anyway, the song she ended up singing was 8 years older than she was.
That's all it takes.
Yeah, but she didn't know. Because she assumed it was ancient, you know? You find these wonderful kind of doggerel songs among some of the indigenous peoples in Taiwan, which they assume to be older than time itself, which turn out to have been taught to them by Chinese merchants 50 years earlier. It's a particular problem with indigenous studies.
Yes, because there's nothing written down, there's nothing recorded.
There's nothing written down, there's nothing recorded, and we have these, oral traditions which may or may not stretch back a long way. I mean, one of the opening elements in Rebel Island in the history of Taiwan is the story of the Pasta Ai ritual, which is this amazing biannual ritual that's conducted by the Saisiat people in Taiwan, and it celebrates, or rather commemorates and attempts to atone for a genocide they committed against another tribe. The question is then, well, when did this happen? Because there's one argument that it happened 400 years ago, and there's one argument that it happened 4,000 years ago. And so yes, I can't remember what the question was now.
Well, I slightly derailed this because I just got interested in the fact that songs were an interest of you, and I'd sort of picked it up in the book. But look, you open your book, so let's go to that, because I thought it was it was a very arresting opening, very interesting, which is the wreck of the rover.
Mm-hmm.
And that was back in 1867, I think. And so that's sort of quite a long way into the history of Taiwan that you cover in the book, but you sort of kick off with that. And my sense was that this was to introduce what I saw as one of the key themes of your book, which is the perpetual conflict in Taiwan between the outsiders and the indigenous peoples. Do you want to sort of tell the story of the rover? Because I think it's a good one.
I decided to kick off with the rover in part because it's a great story, and despite generations of history professors trying to stop people using the mode of implotment to stop people telling stories in history and expecting them to have some kind of narrative force, the popular historian has to fight against that and try and entertain people as well. I think the rover is a very entertaining story. And I chose it partly because the crew of the rover, when they're wrecked on the coast of South Taiwan in 1867, blunder into Taiwan in much the same way that the general reader will. They know nothing about it. They weren't ready for it at all. And they're just hit by all of these things. And I thought that would be a great way to start a book, which is designed for people who know nothing about Taiwan whatsoever. I mean, reviewers have very kindly said it has something to teach old Taiwan hands as well. But it's supposed to be for the general reader. So 1867, there's this American trading vessel called the Rover, and it's dealing with the Chinese. It's heading from Swatow on the South Chinese coast, and it's going up to Manchuria. And the waters are very dangerous, both because of humans and because of rocks. So they decide to go around the back of Taiwan, around on the eastern side of Taiwan. The mapping in those days was very poor. There were no lighthouses. They came way too close to a load of rocks that they knew were there, but they thought they could try and make it past them, and they didn't. And they smashed into these rocks, and the ship foundered. And it took on water and it started to capsize. And so they had to jump into the boats and run for it. And they were at sea for about 17 hours. Very, very strong currents in South Taiwan, but they eventually kind of sloshed ashore at the very, very southern tip of Taiwan into native territory, into the territory of the in fact, it was a tribe called the Coalat Paiwan. That area of Taiwan is a very, very tiny patchwork of different little tribal communities. If they'd been 300 yards further down the beach, they would have come into the land of a completely different tribe. but they found themselves in the world of the coal at Taiwan. And as they sloshed ashore, Captain Joseph Hunt's wife, Mercy, saw a woman on the shoreline, a native woman. So she kind of ran over to her and she tried to say, as best she could in sign language and gestures, we're wrecked, can you help us? And this woman stared at her for a bit and then ran into the forest. And Mercy said, well, I don't know if that's really worked, but we'll find out, I suppose. And then a while later, a bunch of Coalit tribesmen come running out of the forest and kill them all. One of them gets away. One of the sailors gets away to tell the tale, but the rest of them are all murdered by Coalit tribesmen. What the Hunts didn't know was that they had very unluckily come ashore in the middle of this big Coalit ritual where the local men had to win a head in order to win a wife. So that didn't help. Also, the Coalit were incredibly suspicious of foreigners because they had been raided in the past by people from an unknown country, probably China, I expect, but it could have been anyone in South Taiwan. And this is something that happens dozens of times in Taiwanese history. On this occasion, well, firstly there was a survivor, and secondly, the Coalit were absolutely aghast at what had happened themselves, because they were only supposed to kill men. Mercy Hunt had normally wore these big Victorian dresses, but they got wet when they got off the ship, so she was wearing a sailor's clothes. They thought she was a man, and they killed her. They started to believe that there was a curse on their village and that all these various things that were happening to them, people being eaten by sharks, for example, were the result of this attack. Meanwhile, Mercy Hunt had a very wealthy family back home in America. And so her relatives offered $2,500 for the return of her remains for a Christian burial, which at the time was what a working man could expect to earn in a year. It was a lot of money. So suddenly you get all of these fortune hunters descending on the south of Taiwan, trying to deal with the tribesmen, saying, hey, have you killed anyone lately that we could buy the body off you? We'll give you $15. That's one of them actually offered them $15 for it. And so the tribes are getting very nervous about this now and wondering what's going on. Meanwhile, in Amoy, across the water, the American consul decides that he's going to take matters into his own hands. And he's a fantastic historical character called Charles Legendre. He was born in France, but he emigrated to the United States just in time for the Civil War, where he made a lot of money, but also got shot in the face. He had a bit of his nose missing. He only had one eye. He was a real wreck of a human being. But he had this idea in his head that he could really deal with the Chinese, and he felt that Taiwan was a microcosm of China as a whole. He actually wrote a book called How to Deal with China, which he framed as advice to the Secretary of State. And the Secretary of State said, I want nothing to do with this, take it away. But he printed up 200 copies of it and strewed it liberally around the overseas community, trying to make himself look like he knew what he was talking about. And he had this real desire to make a name for himself. He'd been reprimanded repeatedly by the American government for taking matters too far into his own hands. But he did it again, and he managed to convince the Chinese that they were taking an expedition to punish the Coal at Taiwan. He then climbed aboard the ship and went with them, and went into negotiations with the leader of the Coal, who was a man called Tokitok. His name was Guruligur Tokitok, but the Americans called him Tokitok. And so the Coalit explained why the Hunts had been killed. Legendre tried to explain why this wasn't a good thing. And the Coalits tried to explain, well, this is our land. We didn't ask you to come here, which is one of the big moments of self-determination, really. It's all the Americans arrived with this assumption of salvage, with this assumption of rescue, with this idea of the law of the sea, which actually dates all the way back to Justinian, that people are obliged to help each other. And the Coalit's like, nope, didn't get that memo. But anyway, Tokitok was a very powerful leader. He led a confederation of 18 tribes in the south. He was impressed by the firepower the Americans brought with them, but he was also impressed by Legendre, who did all these kind of parlor tricks. There was one moment when he said, if you don't cooperate, I'm going to pull out my own eye and put it on the table to watch over us while we talk. And then he pulled out his fake eye and stuck it on the table, and they just weren't ready for that at all. And so eventually they had a deal. They did a deal. Tokitok said, okay, next time someone's shipwrecked on the shore, put up a red flag. We will take care of them. You've got to reimburse us, with some money and stuff. But if you do that, we'll hand these people back because we don't want the trouble. We don't want foreigners coming here. We don't want the Chinese coming here. We just want to be left alone. And if this is what it takes, this is what we'll do. That brings me to one of the point I'm really making with the introduction, which is that at one level, this is a dodgy American wide boy doing a handshake deal with a local gangster not to murder people. But at another level, it is a man with American consular authority signing a treaty with a local ruler who is not Chinese. And the Chinese on Taiwan are claiming to own the whole island. It sets a precedent for there being a multiplicity of views in Taiwan, a multiplicity of polities. The idea that the Chinese didn't control it all. The idea that this thing called the Sekalu Confederacy in South China, in South Taiwan, could be a nascent state, a primitive state, perhaps by the standards of the Americans, but nevertheless a state that they were dealing with at a consular level. There are also historiographical problems with this. I mean, while that's a really interesting argument to have, and it's one I have repeatedly throughout the book about various other state entities in Taiwan, I'm also a little bit suspicious about the historiography because, as I point out in the book, so much of what I learned about Taiwanese history at university was completely overwritten in the last 25 years because the political situation changed in Taiwan. The ruling Kuomintang were thrown out. The Democratic Progressive Party came in. They promoted huge outpouring of indigenous studies and revisionist history and revisionist approaches to history, all of which are very legitimate. But in the process of doing so, they might have privileged certain narratives that didn't necessarily deserve that privileging. In the case of the word Sekalu, for example, the name of this confederacy, if you poke around online, you can't find that word being used in Chinese before, I think, about 2016. Before that point, the only time Sekalu turns up in Chinese is when is the name of the home planet of Doctor Who's Daleks. Skaro is Sekalu in Chinese. So it could be a coincidence that it just doesn't get mentioned till 2016 in what passes for the online archive. Or it could be that it was widely discussed in indigenous discussions and in indigenous publications and obscure books that never made it to, a library in London, for example. But, what that I hope establishes is that Taiwan is not just a Chinese state. It is also a state that has multiple indigenous communities within it. And although they've been pushed far, far into the hinterland and are now a tiny percentage of the population, they still nevertheless may have a say in how the future of the country looks.
I'm interested you say that it's not just a Chinese state, because what very much surprised me was that you had the Dutch establish a colonial presence on Taiwan. And I'm kind of interested, why were they there in the first place? What were they up to? But the thing that really surprised me was that they were the reason the Chinese were there. At least they were the reason the Chinese were there in large numbers. What were the Dutch up to, and why are they linked with the Chinese like that?
Well, the Dutch were the Dutch East India Company, and as usual, they were up to no good. Their main interests in Taiwan were they'd been kicked out of Macau by the Portuguese. They were fighting for control of the trade routes with the Portuguese and the Spanish. As a technological determinist issue, their shipping was good enough to make it to the Far East now, and so they had the ability to trade in the Far East, and the Chinese didn't want them to. And so, like all dodgy dealers on the seas from the Vikings onwards, they found an offshore bastion that they could control, which would allow them close access to the Chinese and to the Japanese, but also, not be on the mainland. The great thing about Taiwan is it's always been a backdoor to Japan. Back in the olden days, back in the Ming Dynasty, it was illegal to leave a Chinese port with more than 2 days' food and water. And the idea behind that was that you could go fishing, but you'd have to come home again. And Taiwan was this fantastic thing just beyond the horizon because you could sail. I'm leaving port now. I've just got my 2 days of water. See you, bye. And you'd sail out. You go over the horizon to Taiwan. It's only a day and a half away. You could restock on Taiwan and then sail leapfrog all the way up the Ryukyu Islands to Japan. trade in Japan, offload your Chinese silk that you had in your hold instead of fish, buy a load of Japanese stuff, mainly swords. They were very keen on swords, come down the Ryukyu Islands and go back into port in Fujian in China, and no one was any the wiser. So it was always part of this kind of marine trade network, and the Dutch latched onto that as a great place to have a little base of their own. They were trading with the Chinese, and they were trading with the Japanese. Japan, at the time the Dutch arrived, was in the process of shutting itself down, shutting itself away from the outside world, and the Dutch were one of the few foreign peoples who were permitted access to Japan. And one of the things that Taiwan had that the Dutch really exploited was deer. Because deer hides were an absolutely vital component in samurai armor and in samurai saddles. And in the course of 300 years of civil war in Japan, the Japanese had pretty much killed all their deer. So Taiwan, which was riddled with deer, was this huge market in the 17th century for deer hides. And then the various bits and bobs of the deer, the giblets and the penis and everything, would be hacked off and dried and sold to the Chinese. And the meat was dried and sold somewhere else. The horn was used. It was a very lucrative trade for them. So the Dutch did great on that. And also, camphor and a bunch of other things as well. The Dutch did very well with. But as you say, yes, I mean, one of the things that the Dutch wanted to do was to have a permanent colony, and which required large amounts of manpower. And this is another controversial issue in terms of historiography, because Chinese historians want to tell you that Taiwan and China have had incredibly busy trade contacts for hundreds and hundreds of years. But the evidence presented archaeologically and also in a documentary sense is that the Chinese presence on Taiwan was incredibly low until the Dutch showed up. When the Dutch started shipping thousands of Chinese settlers to Taiwan in order to build farms and shops and so on, communities around Taiwan to create a colony, because the Dutch were very, very low in number. There are only a few dozen of them at any point. So they needed local manpower, and they got that from China. So you get this huge influx of Chinese settlers into Taiwan, which is largely Dutch created. The Dutch are basically responsible for that. But you can quibble with that as well, if you like, because the Dutch didn't have enough ships to move all those people. So they leaned on Chinese smugglers to bring those people over. And Zhang Zhelong, Nicholas Iquan, who was who ended his life he ended his life. It's a long story how he ended his life.
We'll maybe get to that.
Yeah, but he was probably instrumental in shipping these people over. So they used Chinese manpower, but there were Dutch people at the top making the decision to take those people there, and many of them were very grateful to go, because China was in the middle of a very difficult climatic period, and also eventually invaded by the Manchus. So it was a very attractive proposition to run over the horizon and settle somewhere else.
And as you say, the Dutch were up to no good. I mean, I don't have a rosy-eyed view of the British Empire, but when I compare it to some of the other imperial projects, I'm sort of stunned by the massacres and barbarity that get carried out, say, by the Portuguese when they're conquering or when they're moving into the Indian Ocean. And I sort of feel the Dutch, they are absolutely ruthless, aren't they? And you talk about is it the Lamey Island massacre? I mean, it was quite shocking.
I'm not going to get into relative arguments about who was the worst imperialist, mainly because I think it takes us down a road that no one wants to go to, which would be me pointing out that the most successful imperialist power in Asia in the 18th century was China, which doubled the size of its empire in the 80 years after they took over Taiwan. But we'll get to that, I expect. Yes, the Dutch, the British, the French, the Belgians have all been awful in the way they treat people. And it's often, I'm not defending it in any way, but I think it's often a technological determinist issue. I mean, we are bringing these people with vast firepower into places that don't have any. And so it becomes much easier to massacre entire communities when you have the technology to do so, even if you're not planning on doing so. In the case of the Lamey Island massacre, if you asked the Dutch at the time what they were doing, they would tell you that they were avenging an injustice against them. The exact wording is, it was an example for their murderous actions against our people, because there was a Dutch ship which disappeared in the China Seas called the Beverwijk, and it turned out it took It took about 5 years for them to work out what had happened to it, but eventually they worked out that it had run ashore on a place called Lamey Island in South Taiwan, and the survivors of the ship had come ashore, much like the people would do on the rover 200 years later, and were massacred by the locals, much as the crew of the rover were. But unfortunately for the Lamey Islanders, they left evidence around of bits of the ship and stuff they'd stolen from the crew of the Beverwyck. And so when the Dutch found that out, they sent a military party against them, which it comprised, there were 100 Dutchmen in the party, but they were outnumbered by Taiwanese people. So a lot of the atrocities may have been committed by Taiwanese people against other Taiwanese people. But I think the really atrocious thing about the Lamey Island incident was that the people, men, women, and children, tried to hide in caves, and the Dutch lit fires at the caves and basically smoked them out. And those who wouldn't come out were suffocated, and those who did come out were killed. So it was a genocidal act against the Lamey Islanders. I mean, some of them were enslaved, and at least one of them became a servant of the Dutch East India Company and ended up living in Amsterdam.
History is so strange that way. He ends up with a Dutch wife in Amsterdam. Two Dutch wives. It's extraordinary.
Hasn't he suffered enough? He's got two Dutch wives, and they called it. His name is. He's recorded on the church list as Jacob Lamey van Taiwan.
Extraordinary.
But anyway, yeah. So the Lamey Island massacre was a horrible thing. Yeah, so it's difficult to once you start talking about colonial history, you're always in this problem of empire being a thing that turns people into terrible people, because it's not just the technology that allows you to kill; it's the vast amounts of money at stake for people about being able to exploit certain resources and not really caring about the people who have some kind of right on those resources.
So we've established that the Dutch are not necessarily great people to have around, but you've kind of foreshadowed this a little bit, because the Mings and the Manchus in China, well, the Manchus invade China and are attacking the Ming, who are being driven back and back and back, and that then has huge consequences for the history of Taiwan in due course. So what's happening somewhere else is...
Well, firstly, I think I should probably point out that saying that the Manchus invaded China is not permissible today. It's absolutely true. The Ming dynasty's own records say, and then these foreigners called the Manchus showed up and invaded us. But one of the problems with writing history today about China is that the People's Republic keeps changing the rules. Their own pursuit of a diverse nation, a nation with over 50 ethnic minorities in it, is that Han people are not the only Chinese people. There are Mongols, there are Taiwanese, there are Zhuang, and the Manchus are one of these peoples.
Right.
And this creates all kinds of trouble for historians, to the extent that last month I was in Shanghai and I went down Fuzhou Street, which used to be the street of bookshops, and there's only a couple of bookshops left there now. But there's a massive place called the City of Books, and I went in there. They had a huge history section, and I was very interested in the Chinese history section. And they had some very high quality books in the Chinese history section, all of which I'd already read in English, because it looked like the new Chinese history publishing, they've just given up. And so, one of the most interesting new books about Chinese history was by Timothy Brooke, which 2 years earlier had already been published in English, but now it's in Chinese, because it's just too dangerous to say anything about. The closer you get to the present day in Chinese history, the more trouble you're likely to get into by saying, for example, the Manchus invaded China. Even though they came from north of the Great Wall, clues in the name, across that wall and attacked China and took it over and announced that they were the new rulers, they were very keen to establish themselves as legitimate inheritors of the mandate of heaven. One of the reasons that they moved so fast was that the Ming dynasty was falling apart. It was rotten from the inside. Many people were very happily changing sides to the Manchus. Nobility retained their ranks even and just said, okay, well, different hat on, different haircut, but business continues as usual. And this wave of Manchu attacks came south very quickly. Within 2 or 3 years, the whole of China had been taken over, taking the Manchus themselves by surprise. But there was a kind of hotbed of resistance down in the southeast of China, led by, it wasn't led by anybody initially. But there was a fugitive pretender, a fugitive Ming emperor who was supposedly the current candidate to replace the now dead last ruler of the Ming. And he fled to Fujian in search of help, and he got help from Nicholas Iquan, this smuggler that I mentioned, who was the master of this massive fleet. He was probably the richest man in the world at that time. That's how big a guy he was. And the Chinese had made him an admiral to stop him being a criminal. And so this fugitive pretender leaned on Nicholas Iquan and said, can you just help me? And he had nothing to offer him except titles. So he was handing out titles everywhere. You're a duke, you're a prince, and he said to Nicholas Iquan's son, you have my surname. It was like a symbolic adoption of Nicholas Iquan's son. He said to this boy, you are the bearer of the national name. You are the knight of the national name, Guo Xingye, which is where the name Koxinga comes from. Koxinga, starstruck at this attention from this pretender, swore lifelong allegiance to the Ming. So even after his father switched sides, even after Fujian was conquered, Koxinga became the leader of the Ming resistance, and he would continue to fight the Manchus for 20 years.
But it doesn't go terribly well in China, does it? So he ends up having to hop over to Taiwan.
It doesn't go very well for him. He takes so long. Basically, he's the inheritor of a marine empire, of his father's coastal empire, and he can't really get off the coasts. He's got a lot of support on the coast, but nothing going on further inland. And as a generation passes, there are people growing up now who don't even know what the Ming dynasty is. They've grown up in this Manchu state, and they don't know what they don't know what they would be fighting for. In the 1650s, he makes I think 1657, he makes an assault on Nanjing. He goes up the river to Nanjing, but refuses to attack it because Nanjing switched sides without a fight when it was invaded by the Manchus. So he wants it to switch sides without a fight to him, and it doesn't do it, and he's eventually beaten back. And the Manchus are so angry with this continued needling at their sides that they proclaim an edict that the coastline is to be depopulated 20 miles inland. So 1,000 miles of coastline, basically from Hong Kong to Shanghai, is entirely razed to the ground, depopulated. The people are thrown out, their livestock's killed, salted land. Nothing can live there. And so left with very little option, Koxinga moves to Taiwan. He moves his army, which is a huge army, to Taiwan. Unfortunately, the Dutch are already there. And so we have the siege of Fort Zeelandia in what is now Tainan, where Koxinga takes on the Dutch, and after a long siege, defeats them and throws them out of the country, off the island. He dies soon afterwards, but for the next 20 years, his family is basically running this resistance operation from Taiwan, which isn't very successful. Basically, it's going to take them a generation to grow the food and breed the soldiers to stake this comeback. So basically, they're on Taiwan in their own little private kingdom, running a kind of zombie Ming dynasty. They keep the Ming calendar. They report to an empty throne because the Ming emperor's not there, and they refuse to give up on the idea of being the Ming dynasty. And there's quite strong evidence that if they'd have just knuckled under and said, "Fine, okay, we're not the Ming dynasty anymore," they would have been treated like Korea.
Right.
They would have said, okay, well, you're not part of China, but you're kind of a tributary nation. Send us a few presents once a year and we'll send you some stuff back. And we'll just, use our calendar. Everything will be fine. But they just clung. They just clung to this think Ming was their, Siming was their, that was the name of Koxinga's base. On the mainland for a long time, and the big kind of slogan for them was Hanqing Fu Ming, resist the Qing, the Manchus, restore the Ming, which was a kind of watchword. It was a sort of a shibboleth among the triads and the secret societies that they all pretended they were Ming revolutionaries, kind of undercover for the next 200 years.
The Chinese are terribly good. The Chinese are terribly good at these punchy slogans. Chairman Mao had some great ones, and
he did have some very good ones.
I can see where he got his examples from.
As my Chinese teacher once said, the way to make a 4-character phrase is to get 4 characters and bung them together. And this is something that I think a lot of foreigners don't appreciate. One of the reasons that Weibo, Twitter, the Chinese version of Twitter, is so big in China is that 120 characters in Chinese is a short essay. So you can say so much more in Chinese with a more limited amount of data because the characters can be so expressive and so poetic.
Well, we better not go down Twitter. So the Manchus, that's the Qing dynasty now. They've now somehow lost the name Manchu and become the Qing dynasty. So they're fed up with these Ming pretenders. I think that's where we've gotten to.
Yeah, and so the Manchus, as you say, they proclaim themselves as the Qing dynasty. They say, no, we are the legitimate inheritors. We're just a new dynasty. We've come along. The Ming have lost the mandate of heaven. We have been chosen to take over, and this means that everyone on Taiwan is a rebel and they have to be put down. And so eventually they send a fleet to Taiwan, which is led by a man called Shulang, who was a former officer in Koxinga's army but defected. And they take Taiwan. They round up all of the Ming soldiers and they give them a job. They send them off to the Mongolian border. A lot of the Russian fights with so-called Chinese soldiers were actually with these former Ming loyalists who'd been sent to Albazin and kind of left there as kind of cannon fodder on the borders. And the leader of the Koxinga's forces on the Penghu Islands, he ended his days as the captain of the guard at one of the gates of Beijing. It was understood that they were loyal for the right reasons, and they weren't necessarily punished for it. I mean, you could get into trouble for all kinds of things in Manchu China, but being a Ming loyalist who surrendered was not one of them. But then the Manchus have got this island, which they never wanted. The Manchus are they're Jurchen people. They are steppe riding nomads. Some people talk about them being afraid of the sea. I think fear might be too strong a word, but they certainly weren't used to it. And didn't really have any truck with it or any understanding of how the sea might work. They didn't want to trade with other countries. They didn't want to have a marine presence. They didn't want to have a fleet. And so the emperor at the time just says, well, what are we doing with it? It's just a ball of mud. Let's just, leave it. We've got rid of the Ming people. We can just leave it. And Shulang says, no. We have to hang on to it. And I think partly that's Shulang having fought for years to gain this island, not wanting to just walk away from it. But also with a real strategic understanding, he knew that if they abandoned Taiwan, the Dutch and the English and the Portuguese would all be back. I mean, the English were already sniffing around. The Opium Wars are still 150 years in the future, but the European powers and subsequently the Americans are all poking at the edges of China, interested in trade, wanting to deal with the Chinese on an equal footing, which the Chinese refuse to do because they are an empire and their ruler is the ruler of the world. So you can't just, establish a treaty with them. So Shulang goes, no, we have to hang on to Taiwan. So with great reluctance, the Manchus keep Taiwan. And it becomes a relatively lawless place. I mean, they don't have very good control over it. They don't have any real interest in it particularly. So it gets colonized by a lot of wheeler dealers, a lot of merchants coming over from China to offload dodgy goods on the natives and exploit the natives as well. I mean, one of the things, for example, that really causes trouble and continues to get worse and worse as time goes by is camphor. Because camphor is a vital ingredient in various medicines, but as time goes on, it also is a vital ingredient in early plastics, in photography, and in smokeless gunpowder. So Taiwan, this stupid little island that no one wants, which is full of these ancient camphor trees, and so the Chinese are coming into the woods and chopping them down. The thing is that lumber is technically owned by the Chinese Navy. It's a Navy purview. So the Navy says, don't do that. That's native land. Stay away from it. But nevertheless, there's a lot of money in camphor. So these traders come in to get it. And the way that you get camphor from a tree is you have to cut the tree down. You have to hack it up into wood chips, and then you burn them to create this kind of smoke, and you kind of siphon off the whatever the camphor juice is as it comes off the wood chips. So you destroy the tree to get your harvest. Then you need another tree. So these settlers are going further and further inland into Taiwan, running into native tribes who don't know what they're doing there and want to get rid of them. And so you have these repeated incidents of what is described as native rebellion, but is actually Chinese traders going into an area, pushing too far, getting murdered, and then a punitive expedition setting out. So much like the Rover incident again. But with a lot more malice of forethought on the part of the Chinese.
There was an interesting incident as well. There's a theme of shipwrecks in your book. I guess this is again getting a bit later on, but these are the British ships. I think they're called the Nerbudda and the Anne, which end up being shipwrecked during the time when the Manchus are in charge. I didn't quite understand why exactly, but they're all executed.
The Nerbudda and the Anne are two very different ships. The Nerbudda is a transport ship carrying workers, Indian workers actually, probably for the military. I mean, let's not forget, by 1841, which is when this happens, Britain and China are at loggerheads with the Opium Wars.
Right.
So a British transport ship sailing close to Chinese territory with a bunch of personnel on board is a difficult matter. And so the Nerbudda, it foundered on the rocks near Tainan. The crew, the top crew, so basically the white men on board, took to the lifeboats and ran for it.
Yeah,
and they abandoned the Indians, the Indian workers on board. There were 240 of them, and 90 of them either died on board or drowned attempting to evacuate the ship. Which it didn't sink. It eventually kind of came off the rocks and just drifted without a mast for 5 days. And they ended up so close to the coastline they could kind of put these rafts together and get to the coast. So 150 of them made it to the coast, and then they were captured by the Chinese. And the authorities reported back to Beijing. They said, "Yep, our coastal cannons did a number on the British. Yeah, we sunk their ship and we've captured their men. What do we do with these men?" And they go, "I better kill them, I suppose." Which is not true. Their coastal cannons were terrible.
Yeah,
they just rounded up some starving men on the shore. And of course, because they'd done that, a month later, the HMS Nimrod arrives and says, "We're going to give you $100 per captive if you just give these men back." And the Chinese go, "Well, we're not giving them back." So Nimrod just destroys the forts at Geelong, takes out 27 Chinese cannon. So that didn't go down very well. And the following year, there's another ship which is wrecked, which is the Anne, but that's not a military ship. That's an opium dealer's ship. Let's not forget that we're busy. Yeah, we are busy selling crates of opiates to the Chinese, addicting their population, dragging them down into this kind of vicious circle of addiction and crime. And the Anne is absolutely full of money from a drugs deal at the mouth of the Yangtze, and it ran aground off Taiwan. And the captain kept on. There were all these junks going past, and the captain's going, "Come on, take us to safety, take us to safety." But no one would take them away. So it was seized, and it had all this money from an illegal drug deal, and it had all these crew members on board. And I think there were about 40, surviving on the Anne. And while they were kind of being held captive and then executed, the Opium War ended. The first Opium War ended. So Hong Kong was handed to the British. And extraterritoriality, the safety of British subjects in China, was guaranteed, which of course is bad news if you're the magistrate in Taiwan who's just executed 187 British subjects. So it became a huge cause célèbre among the overseas communities, and it was covered up by the Chinese and the Europeans.
As I understood it, the Chinese, punished the officials, severely and let them go pretty much the next day. And
the Chinese position was the officials shouldn't have lied about the effectiveness of their cannon. So they were slapped on the wrist and sent away, on some kind of, a cannon awareness course or whatever it is. And then a couple of days later, were just back at their jobs as usual. It just looked good on paper for them to be shown to be punished. But
I thought it was interesting that the British decided that they really didn't want the general public to know about this, because the last thing they needed was some sort of a newspaper campaign that action must be taken. They just wanted to.
Absolutely. I think part of the issue was that the legal argument would be made on behalf of subjects of the Raj. They didn't want to go to war on behalf of Indians. I think was probably the racist excuse.
Gosh.
But I think generally they didn't want to go to war anyway. I mean, the Opium War was very costly, incredibly embarrassing. I mean, the more you know about the Opium War, the more horrifying it is to see. If you look at Hansard, at the time, there are members of Parliament saying this is the most shameful thing the British have ever done. And here we are just signing off on it, and now we've got an island called Hong Kong for it. Well done. Yeah, it was covered up. It was not widely discussed. James Davison, who was a journalist in Taiwan at the time, he said, if this made it out, it would be the cause of another war. You don't kill 187 British subjects with impunity just after a treaty's been signed guaranteeing their safety and not expect to get bombed back into the Stone Age. But nevertheless, they did cover it up. Not that it did much good, because there was another Opium War after that. So
even worse.
It all kicked off again.
Yes, I was. Your reference to Hong Kong reminded me of a line in the book where somebody in China said, well, in order to punish the British for stealing Hong Kong, why don't we give them Taiwan as well? Because they found it such a difficult place to manage.
I mean, Taiwan was a real albatross around the necks of the Manchus. They never wanted it in the first place. It was always causing trouble for them. It completely unbalanced the Chinese sense of themselves, the acquisition of Taiwan, because until Taiwan, the Manchus' concept of what China was established by geographical limits. It's like, well, there's tundra in the north, and there's the coast on the east, and there's jungles in the south, and then there's a big desert in the west, and so China is the bit you can live in the middle of all that. And when they acquired Taiwan, that completely wrong-footed their kind of sense of what China could be. And as I said, in the 80 years after they acquired Taiwan, they actually advanced west and doubled the size of their country. Inner and Outer Mongolia, Tibet, Xinjiang, these were all acquired in the 80 years after the acquisition of Taiwan. And so the modern borders of Taiwan, of China as we know them, were established then. And so that's why you have this kind of inner and outer China. You have this kind of the areas in the west, which are always so politically problematic, were acquired at that time. So the Manchus didn't really want Taiwan. It kept on causing troubles. They said, I have to look at my own book to see what the governor said about it. But it's the epigraph. I begin the book with, every 3 years an uprising, every 5 a rebellion. So Taiwan was always causing trouble for them, hence the title Rebel Island. And so, yes, someone did say, well, let's get them back for Hong Kong. Let's make them take Taiwan as well. That'll learn them. And there were several attempts to offload Taiwan on passing nations. They said we could sell it to the French. During the Sino-French War, there was this suggestion, maybe we could just give them Taiwan, they'll go away. And of course, eventually, it was offloaded on the Japanese. There was the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 5 was mainly fought in Korea, as most Sino-Japanese wars are. But right at the end of the war, in fact, during the negotiations for the Treaty of Shimonoseki, the Japanese fleet just raced south to Taiwan and took it over. The Chinese, the Manchus in Beijing said, yeah, okay, fine. I mean, if that's what we have to do, take Taiwan. I mean, we never wanted it. Who cares? Turned out a lot of the Chinese people did care. It turned out that there were protests in the streets about betraying sovereign Chinese territory.
This is protests in the streets of mainland China.
Protests in Beijing saying, "What? This is not right. Well, what are you thinking? You're just giving this away. Mm-hmm. You can't just give away. Haven't we given away enough?" Mm. And a lot of those people protesting had never been to Taiwan, and possibly,
Oh, sure, but I haven't been to the Falkland Islands, so
yes, exactly. So there were some kind of hawkish Chinese, or if you like, patriotic Chinese, saying that's our island, fair and square. We shouldn't just hand it to the Japanese. There were very mixed feelings in Taiwan about it. You have people in the capital city, the merchants in the capital city, desperate for the Japanese to arrive, really looking forward to having someone who knows what they're doing in charge. But the further south you go in Taiwan, the larger the anti-Japanese feeling is, and the larger the sense of a resistance there is, to the extent you actually get several groups within Taiwan proclaiming that if the Chinese have let them down, they have to stand up for themselves, and proclaiming a republic of Formosa.
Okay, well, let's close part one of our podcast there, because I think we've reached a sort of a key inflection point in the history of Taiwan. And next week we'll pick up the story of the Japanese colony and taking it down into the present day. So Jonathan Clements, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.